Somewhere in the middle of Florida in the early 1890s, a group of tired men were digging for gray rock. They were not looking for treasure. They were not looking for bones. They were just trying to make $2 a day, standing knee-deep in mud under a sun that never seemed to let up. Then, without warning, the ground in front of them gave way. It did not crack slowly. It dropped all at once, like the earth had been holding its breath and finally let it out. Dust rolled up out of the hole. Birds scattered from the nearby trees. And when the dust settled, one of the men leaned over the edge with his shovel still in his hand, and he saw something sticking out of the broken dirt that made him forget, just for a second, that he was supposed to be afraid. It was white, it was huge, and it did not look like anything that belonged on a Florida farm. The man next to him stopped digging too, then another. Within a minute, the whole crew had gathered around the edge of that fresh hole, leaning on their shovels, staring down at something none of them had a name for. Somebody muttered a question nobody could answer. Somebody else took a step back, like the thing might still be alive. The foreman, whoever he was that day on that crew in that pit, probably stood there just as confused as everyone else, because nothing about his job had prepared him for this. He had been hired to find rock. Grey, dull, ordinary rock that companies up north would pay good money for. Nobody warned him that the ground itself might open up and hand him something out of a nightmare. And the wildest part is, this was not a freak accident that happened once. It happened again and again, in different pits in different counties on different days, year after year, all across the same stretch of central Florida. Every single time, the men digging had the exact same reaction: confusion, disbelief, fear mixed with a strange kind of fascination they could not quite shake off. That moment, repeated in different places, on different days, by different crews of forgotten men, is the true beginning of one of the strangest chapters in American history. It happened in a part of Florida that would later get a nickname so fitting that it stuck forever. They called it Bone Valley, and what came pouring out of the ground there did not just surprise a few tired laborers. It rewrote what scientists thought they knew about the ancient world that used to sit right where Florida sits today. Stick around, because before this story is over, you are going to meet giant sloths the size of delivery trucks, elephants with 4 tusks, cats with teeth like daggers, sharks bigger than school buses, and a whole lost world that had been sleeping under Florida sand for millions of years. And you are going to find out exactly why, after pulling all of that up into the daylight, the very same men who found it ended up burying the holes right back over again. Let's go back to the beginning, because to really understand what happened, you need to understand what Florida looked like before any of this started. In the 1880s, Central Florida was mostly known for one thing: oranges. Citrus groves stretched out across the rolling land, and for a lot of families those trees were everything. They were the bank account, the inheritance, the whole future. Towns grew up around the groves. Railroads were built just to carry crates of oranges north to cities that could not get enough of them. For a while, it felt like Florida had found its golden ticket, and that ticket smelled like orange blossoms. But Florida had another secret hiding in its dirt, one that almost nobody knew about yet. In 1881, an Army engineer named Captain Francis LeBaron was surveying along the Peace River, doing nothing more exciting than measuring water depth and mapping the riverbanks. While he was out there, he noticed strange grey pebbles scattered along the riverbed. They did not look like much, just dull, round little rocks. But something about them caught his attention, and he picked a few up and kept them. It took years before anyone realized what those pebbles actually were. They were phosphate, and phosphate, it turned out, was about to become one of the most valuable substances in the entire country. Here is why that mattered so much. Farms all across America were starting to wear out their soil. Decades of growing the same crops over and over had drained the land of the nutrients it needed. Farmers needed something to put back into the ground to keep their fields alive, and phosphate was exactly that. It was the secret ingredient in fertilizer, the stuff that could take tired, used-up soil and make it grow crops again. Once people figured out that Florida was sitting on top of massive deposits of the stuff, everything changed almost overnight. By 1886, more deposits were found near the same river, and small mining operations started popping up. Word spread the way it always does when there is money involved. It spread fast, and it spread far. Within a few short years, prospectors and speculators and dreamers from all over the country started pouring into Central Florida, all chasing the same grey rock that nobody had cared about a decade earlier. Land that had been worth $1.25 an acre suddenly sold for $300 an acre. Think about that jump for a second. That is not a small increase. That is the kind of number that turns farmers into landlords overnight and turns sleepy little towns into boom towns almost by accident. People who had been struggling to make ends meet on citrus farms found themselves sitting on land that mining companies were desperate to buy. Some of them became rich almost without trying. Others sold too early and watched their neighbors get rich instead. Either way, the whole region was changing shape, and it was changing fast. By 1894, the boom had reached a scale that nobody could have predicted just 5 years earlier. More than 215 separate phosphate mining companies were operating across the state. 215. That is not a handful of small outfits. That is an entire industry exploding into existence in less time than it takes most businesses to even get off the ground. Pits were being dug everywhere across the region that would soon earn its nickname, an area where the borders of several counties came together, a stretch of land that would forever after be known as Bone Valley. Towns that had barely existed a few years earlier suddenly found themselves bursting at the seams. Places like Mulberry, Bartow, and Fort Meade went from sleepy farming communities to bustling little outposts almost overnight, with new buildings going up faster than anyone could keep track of. General stores opened to sell shovels, boots, and supplies to the flood of new arrivals. Boarding houses filled up fast, and when they ran out of room, men slept in tents pitched along the edges of the pits they worked in. Railroad spurs were laid down at a frantic pace, narrow little tracks built specifically to haul phosphate rock away from the mines and toward the rivers and ports where it could be shipped out to the rest of the country and even overseas. Mule-drawn carts rattled along dirt roads from dawn until dusk, carrying loads of rock from one place to another. The whole region had the feel of a gold rush, except instead of glittering nuggets, the prize was dull gray pebbles that almost nobody outside of Florida had ever heard of just a few years before. And as if the timing wanted to push things along even faster, Florida's citrus industry, the one that had been the backbone of the region for so long, took a brutal hit right around this same time. A terrible freeze swept through the state in the winter of 1894 and 1895. Temperatures dropped low enough for long enough to kill entire groves outright. Trees that had taken years to grow were destroyed in a matter of days. Families who had built their whole future around citrus watched their orchards turn black and brittle overnight. It was devastating for anyone who depended on oranges for a living. But here is the strange twist. While one industry was collapsing, another one was exploding, and they were happening in almost the exact same place at almost the exact same time. Farmers who had just lost their groves to the frost suddenly had something else to turn to. The same dirt that had grown their orange trees was now valuable for a completely different reason. People who thought their future had just been wiped out by ice and frost found a new one waiting underground, in the form of dull gray pebbles that could be sold by the ton. So picture the scene in central Florida in 1894. Frozen, dead citrus groves on one side of the road, brand new phosphate pits being dug on the other. Families pivoting overnight from picking oranges to digging rock. It was chaos, it was opportunity, and it was happening at a speed that must have felt dizzying to anyone living through it. Now let's talk about what it actually looked like to work in one of these phosphate pits, because this part of the story is not glamorous. It is hard, dirty, and honestly a little brutal. Picture a wide, shallow pit carved into the Florida landscape. No machines doing the heavy lifting yet, not in these early years. Just men with picks and shovels, standing in mud and water that came up past their knees. The heat in central Florida is no joke, especially in the summer, and these men were out there for 12-hour shifts under a sun that turned the air thick and heavy. Add mosquitoes by the thousands, swarming up off the standing water in every pit. Add the constant risk of the soft, waterlogged ground shifting under their feet. This was not easy money. This was backbreaking labor for about $2 a day, paid to a workforce that was a mix of black and white laborers working side by side, even as the rest of the segregated South kept them divided in almost every other part of life. Cave-ins were a real danger. The ground in this part of Florida sits on top of limestone, and limestone has a habit of dissolving over time when water moves through it. That process carves out hidden pockets and tunnels underground, sometimes for thousands of years, completely invisible from the surface. You could be standing on solid-looking ground one moment, and the next moment, the earth beneath you could simply give way, dropping into a hollow space that had been waiting down there since before humans ever walked on this continent. The miners called these collapses by different names depending on where you were, but today we call them sinkholes, and Florida has more of them than almost anywhere else in the country. That is actually the key to this entire story, so let's slow down for a second and really understand it, because it explains everything that comes next. Florida used to be underwater, not recently. We are talking millions of years ago, when much of the land that is now the Florida Peninsula sat beneath a warm, shallow sea. For millions of years, tiny shells, bones, and minerals drifted down to the bottom of that ancient sea and slowly built up into thick layers of sediment. Over time, all of that buried material turned into rock, specifically a soft, porous kind of limestone. And mixed right into that limestone, packed in tight, was phosphate, the same gray pebbles that started this whole gold rush. But it was not just minerals that got buried down there. It was also bones. Whales swam through those ancient seas. Giant sharks hunted in those waters. As the land slowly rose up out of the ocean and turned into the Florida we recognize today, all of those bones stayed locked inside the rock, sealed away like a message in a bottle that nobody was meant to read for millions of years. Then on top of that ancient seafloor, a completely different chapter of history got written. Long after Florida had become dry land, it was home to enormous Ice Age animals. Mastodons, giant ground sloths bigger than a grizzly bear standing on its hind legs, saber-toothed cats, ancient camels that once roamed across what is now the American Southeast, strange horned creatures that do not even have a close relative alive today. When those animals died, sometimes near rivers or in swampy ground, their bones sank down and settled right on top of that older layer of marine rock, layering one lost world directly above another lost world, like two different chapters of a book pressed together, one written millions of years before the other. So when those phosphate miners started digging down through the Florida dirt in the 1890s, they were not just digging through plain old soil. They were digging straight down through two completely different graveyards stacked on top of each other. One graveyard belonged to ancient sea creatures from millions of years ago. The other belonged to Ice Age land animals that had walked across that same ground in a much more recent chapter, though still long, long before any human being had ever set foot in Florida. Nobody told the miners any of this when they signed up for the job. They were not paleontologists. They were not scientists. Most of them had never heard the word fossil in their entire lives. They were just men trying to earn a living, swinging picks into the dirt because that was the work available, and that work happened to pay better than almost anything else around. So now picture one of those crews, standing in a pit that has gone down maybe 20 or 30 feet below the surface. The walls around them are streaked with that telltale grey phosphate rock, the stuff they are actually being paid to dig out. Sweat is running down their backs. The mosquitoes are relentless. Somebody's pick strikes the wall, and instead of the dull thud of striking rock, there is a different sound. A hollow sound, a crack. Let's slow this moment down, because it is worth really sitting in it. The morning probably started like every other morning that summer. A whistle, or maybe just a foreman's shout, calling the crew together before the sun had fully climbed over the tree line. Men grabbing their tools from wherever they had left them the night before, swapping a few tired words about the heat, about the mosquitoes, about how much longer this particular section of the pit was going to take before the company moved them somewhere else. Nobody was thinking about ancient history. Nobody was wondering what might be buried beneath their boots. They were thinking about lunch, about their aching backs, about getting through another 12 hours so they could collect their $2 and start the whole cycle over again the next day. The pit itself would have looked like a wound cut into the landscape, walls of red and orange clay rising up around them, streaked here and there with the duller grey of the phosphate rock everyone was really after. Water pooled at the bottom in places, thick and murky, stirred up by boots and shovels until it turned the colour of weak coffee. The air down in the pit sat heavier than the air up above, trapped against the walls, thick with the smell of wet earth and sweat, and the faint mineral tang that phosphate rock seems to carry with it. Hour after hour the work was repetitive. Pick, shovel, lift, toss, pick, shovel, lift, toss. The kind of motion that a body learns to do almost without thinking while the mind drifts somewhere far away from the pit, somewhere cooler, somewhere with shade. That is usually how it goes, right before something completely unexpected happens. The mind has wandered off and the body is just going through the motions, and that is exactly the moment the ground decides to interrupt. Maybe it started as a faint vibration underfoot, barely noticeable at first, easy to mistake for nothing more than a heavy cart rolling by somewhere up above. Maybe it built quickly into something undeniable, a deep groan from somewhere beneath the clay, the kind of sound that makes every man in the pit freeze mid-swing and look around for the source. And then, all at once, a section of the pit wall would simply let go. Not crumbling slowly, the way a sandcastle collapses when the tide creeps in. Dropping instead all at once, an entire slab of earth giving way and sliding down into a hollow space that had been sitting there, invisible, for who knows how long. Dust and debris would roll outward in a cloud. Men would stumble back, some shouting, some too stunned to make a sound at all. And then slowly, as the dust began to settle and the immediate fear of being buried alive started to fade, eyes would turn toward the new opening in the wall, toward whatever had just been exposed. Sometimes it really was nothing. Just more rock, more clay, more ordinary dirt, and the crew would catch their breath, mutter a prayer of thanks that nobody had been standing any closer, and get back to work once their nerves settled. But sometimes, mixed into that freshly exposed wall of earth, something would catch the light in a way that plain rock never does. A curve that looked too smooth, too deliberate to be anything natural. A gleam of white or cream-colored material, standing out sharply against the dark red clay surrounding it. That is the moment this entire story turns on. That single second where a tired worker, half expecting nothing more than another ordinary collapse, leans in a little closer and realizes he is looking at something that should not be there. This happened again and again across Bone Valley throughout the boom years. Sometimes it was a small slump, just a few feet of collapsed dirt. Other times, an entire section of pit wall would drop all at once, opening up a much deeper hollow that had been hiding underground, completely invisible just seconds before. The miners would have felt the ground shift under their boots. They would have heard the rumble. And then, once the dust cleared, they would have looked into a freshly exposed wall of earth and seen something that no amount of digging plain grey rock could have prepared them for. Bones, not small ones, not the kind you might see from a deer or a cow that wandered into a swamp and died. These were massive, curved tusks longer than a grown man is tall, still half buried in red clay, gleaming a strange ivory white against the dark dirt around them. Teeth the size of a human hand, with edges that still looked sharp enough to cut. Leg bones so thick that two men could not wrap their arms all the way around them. Try to imagine being one of those workers. You signed up to dig rock for a fertilizer company. Nobody warned you about any of this. You have no idea what a mastodon is. You have probably never even heard the word prehistoric. And now you are standing at the edge of a hole, staring at something that looks like it belongs to a monster out of an old story, half buried in the same dirt you have been shoveling all week for $2 a day. Some of these men were deeply religious, and in a time and place where formal science education was rare, especially for working-class laborers, it would not be surprising if some of them genuinely believed they had stumbled onto the bones of biblical giants. Stories of giants walking the earth were common in the culture of the time, passed down through churches and family Bibles, and finding bones that size in a place nobody expected would have fit right into that kind of explanation for a lot of people. Others probably thought of dragons or sea monsters or something else from the folk stories they had grown up hearing. Whatever explanation they reached for, one thing is certain: nobody expected this, nobody was prepared for it. And the wild part is, this was not a one-time event. This happened over and over in pit after pit all across the region as the phosphate boom rolled on through the 1890s. Bone Valley earned its name for a reason. The fossils were not rare, they were everywhere: tusks, jaws, teeth, vertebrae the size of dinner plates. The deeper the miners dug, the more the land seemed to open up like a vault that had been locked for millions of years, finally giving up everything it had been holding onto. Let's talk about exactly what kinds of creatures these workers were pulling up out of the Florida ground, because honestly, it reads almost like a list of monsters, except every single one of them was real. First, the mastodons. These were close relatives of modern elephants, though not quite the same animal. They were covered in shaggy hair, built heavy and powerful, with long curved tusks they used to strip bark off trees and dig through frozen ground further north, though plenty of them also roamed the warmer landscapes of prehistoric Florida. Finding a mastodon tusk sticking out of a pit wall would have been an unforgettable sight. These were not small bones you could mistake for something ordinary. A single tusk could stretch longer than a man is tall, curving gracefully out of the clay like something carved by a sculptor, except nature had carved it millions of years earlier. Then there were creatures even stranger than mastodons. Gomphethers, distant relatives of elephants that had 4 tusks instead of 2, 2 on the top jaw and 2 on the bottom, an animal that looks almost impossible if you saw a drawing of it today. Imagine being a tired laborer in 1894, uncovering a skull with not 2 but 4 long curved tusks jutting out of it. There would have been no frame of reference for that. Nothing in everyday life would have prepared a person to make sense of what they were looking at. Next came the giant ground sloths. This is one that tends to surprise people the most, because when most folks picture a sloth, they picture a small, slow-moving animal hanging lazily from a tree branch. The ground sloths that once lived in prehistoric Florida were nothing like that. These animals stood taller than a man, with massive curved claws longer than kitchen knives, built heavy and powerful enough to pull down entire tree branches to feed on the leaves. A skeleton like that, half exposed in a collapsed pit wall, would have looked less like a sloth and more like something out of a nightmare. Bones thick as fence posts, claws curling out of the clay like something reaching up out of the ground itself. Saber-toothed cats turned up too, with their famous long curved canine teeth, built for a completely different kind of hunting than any cat alive today. Finding the skull of one of these animals, with those long teeth still intact, jutting down from the upper jaw, would have been bone-chilling in the most literal sense. Even without knowing anything about prehistoric predators, anyone could look at a tooth that long and understand instantly that whatever it belonged to had been built for one purpose, and that purpose was killing. Ancient camels were found as well, which still surprises a lot of people today, because camels are not exactly the first animal anyone associates with prehistoric Florida. But millions of years ago, camels actually evolved in North America before eventually spreading to other parts of the world, and ancient relatives of modern camels once roamed right across this same landscape, long before the phosphate miners ever showed up with their picks and shovels. There were strange horned creatures too, animals with horn arrangements unlike anything alive today, distant relatives of modern deer and antelope, but built in shapes that look almost alien compared to anything walking around now. Three-toed horses turned up in the digging as well, smaller and built differently than the horses we know today, a reminder that even an animal as familiar as the horse went through an entire evolutionary journey before becoming what we recognize now. And then there was the older layer, the one buried beneath even the Ice Age animals, the layer that came from that ancient sea Florida used to be a part of. Whale bones, vertebrae the size of small boulders, smooth and heavy, completely unmistakable once you saw one up close. Bones from ancient relatives of manatees and dugongs, gentle sea creatures that once drifted through the same warm waters that eventually became the phosphate-rich limestone of Bone Valley. And perhaps most famous of all, the teeth of an enormous prehistoric shark, a creature scientists now call megalodon. These teeth were unlike anything a Florida farmer or laborer had ever seen. Triangular, serrated along the edges, and absolutely massive, some of them larger than a grown man's open hand. A single megalodon tooth found in the dirt is striking enough on its own. Finding several of them, scattered through layer after layer of phosphate rock, would have made it clear that whatever used to live in this area, it had not been small, and it had not been gentle. Put yourself in the boots of one of these workers for a moment. You have already pulled mastodon tusks out of the ground. You have already seen sloth claws as long as your forearm. And then your shovel knocks loose a tooth bigger than your hand, with edges that still look sharp enough to cut skin, and you start to realize that this place, this ordinary-looking patch of central Florida farmland, used to be home to creatures that would have terrified anyone who came face to face with them while they were still alive. Word about these discoveries did not stay quiet for long. News like this has a way of traveling, even in an era without telephones in every home or instant communication. Letters got written, stories got told in town squares and church gatherings and general stores, and eventually that word reached people who understood exactly what these bones meant: scientists, museum collectors. The kind of people who had spent their careers studying the deep past, and who suddenly realized that an ordinary mining boom in central Florida had accidentally cracked open one of the richest fossil deposits in the entire country. Paleontologists started making their way down to Bone Valley, sometimes working directly with mining companies, sometimes negotiating with individual miners who had pulled interesting bones out of the ground on their own and kept them as curiosities. Some workers, realizing these bones might be worth something beyond just an oddity to look at, started selling specimens directly to collectors and scientific institutions. A miner could earn a little extra cash on the side just by hanging onto an interesting find, instead of tossing it aside with the rest of the rubble. Picture what that exchange might have looked like. A scientist, dressed in clothes far too formal for a phosphate pit, climbing carefully down into the same muddy hole the workers had been standing in all week, asking questions about exactly where a particular tooth or tusk had been found, how deep, in what layer, surrounded by what other material. For the workers, it must have been a strange kind of validation. Bones they had been hauling out alongside ordinary rock, the ones that had spooked half the crew and made the other half whisper about giants and monsters, were apparently important enough that educated men were traveling a long way just to see them. Some of those scientists came from institutions that would later become some of the most respected natural history collections in the country, places that exist to this day and still curate specimens that trace their origin back to those very same pits. Over the following decades, this steady stream of fossils flowing out of Bone Valley became one of the most important sources of prehistoric animal bones in the entire eastern United States. Museums built entire collections around what came out of those phosphate pits. Scientists used these bones to piece together what the Florida landscape actually looked like millions of years ago, and again during the Ice Age, layer by layer, animal by animal. Today, paleontologists working with institutions like the Florida Museum of Natural History have catalogued well over 50,000 fossils that trace their origin directly back to this region. 50,000. From a mining operation that started because of a few strange pebbles spotted along a riverbank by an army engineer who was really just trying to do his job. Think about that for a second. Without the phosphate boom, without all that backbreaking digging by tired, underpaid laborers who had no idea what they were uncovering, an enormous amount of what we now know about prehistoric Florida might still be buried, completely hidden, sealed away under feet of dirt and rock with nobody ever the wiser. One curator who has worked extensively with these fossils put it simply: many of these discoveries would never have come to light at all if it had not been for the mining industry that exposed them. But here is where the story takes its final turn, and it is the part that gives this entire chapter its bittersweet ending. Phosphate mining is not gentle work, and it never was. The pits dug across Bone Valley were not preserved as historical sites or protected the way a fossil discovery might be handled today. They were business operations, plain and simple. Once a section of a pit had been stripped of its valuable phosphate rock, the mining companies moved on. There was no reason, from a business standpoint, to keep an empty, exhausted pit sitting open in the landscape. Open pits were dangerous. They could fill with stagnant water, breed disease-carrying mosquitoes, swallow wandering livestock, or even collapse further and threaten anyone nearby. So once the rock was gone, the holes had to be dealt with. Many of the pits were left to fill naturally with rainwater and groundwater, slowly turning into ponds and small lakes that still dot the central Florida landscape to this day. If you have ever driven past one of those strange, perfectly placed little lakes scattered across Polk County or Hillsborough County and wondered why it looked so unnatural, so geometrically out of place compared to the rest of the landscape, there is a good chance you were looking at an old phosphate pit, filled in by time and weather long after the miners moved on to dig somewhere new. Other pits were deliberately filled back in, packed with overburden and waste material from nearby digging, smoothed back over until the scar in the landscape disappeared entirely. The earth that had been torn open to reveal tusks and teeth and claws from millions of years in the past was in many cases simply pushed back into place, sealing the hole shut once again. The land returned to looking ordinary, flat, unremarkable. Nothing left to suggest that anything unusual had ever come out of that particular patch of ground. So by the time the phosphate boom started slowing down in the years that followed, much of the physical evidence of these discoveries was gone, vanished back into the earth the same way it had appeared. What remained was scattered. Some of it sat in proper museum collections, carefully labeled and studied. Some of it ended up in private hands, passed down as family curiosities for generations, the stories behind them growing fuzzier with each passing decade. And some of it, almost certainly, was simply lost, destroyed by careless digging, broken apart by men who had no training in how to safely remove a fragile fossil from solid rock, or buried right back into the ground along with everything else when the pits were filled in. It is a strange thought to sit with. An entire lost world, millions of years in the making, was cracked open almost by accident, by men who were only there to dig fertilizer rock. For a brief window of time, that ancient world was visible, right there in the open air, in pits scattered across central Florida. And then, piece by piece, hole by hole, it got covered back up again, the same dirt that had hidden it for millions of years closing back over what was left. The phosphate boom itself eventually slowed down too, though it never fully disappeared. Mining shifted, technology changed, and the brutal 12-hour shifts with picks and shovels eventually gave way to massive mechanical equipment that could move far more earth than any team of men with hand tools ever could. The working conditions that defined those early years, the segregated but side-by-side labor, the $2 a day, the constant danger of cave-ins, all of that slowly transformed over the following decades, though not without struggle. By the time the 1910s rolled around, conditions in the phosphate pits had barely improved for the men doing the actual digging. They were still working 12-hour shifts, still standing for hours in knee-deep slurry, still watching co-workers get hurt or killed in dynamite accidents that were treated as just another cost of doing business. Some mining operations even kept armed guards on horseback watching over the work crews, a chilling reminder of just how little freedom or bargaining power the laborers actually had. For $2 a day, men were risking their lives in conditions that would be unthinkable by modern standards, with almost no legal protection and very little choice but to keep showing up, because the alternative was no income at all. That finally came to a head in April of 1919, when roughly 3,000 phosphate miners, organized together despite the deep racial divisions of the Jim Crow South, walked off the job at 17 different mining operations in the area around the town of Mulberry. For a region that depended so heavily on this single industry, a strike of that size brought things to a screeching halt. It put pressure on a worldwide fertilizer trade that, by this point, depended heavily on Florida phosphate to keep functioning. It was a remarkable moment, not just because of its size, but because black and white miners stood together on the picket line in a part of the country where almost nothing else brought the two groups together as equals. It is a small but important detail in this larger story, a reminder that the bones pulled out of those pits were not the only difficult, hard-won thing to come up out of that ground. So did a fight for basic dignity, fought by men whose names mostly went unrecorded, in towns that most people outside of Florida have still never heard of. But even today, more than a century later, Bone Valley has not finished giving up its secrets. Mining still continues in parts of central Florida, and modern paleontologists still work closely with mining companies, walking active pits, watching for that same telltale gleam of bone in freshly turned earth that those original laborers stumbled across by pure accident back in the 1890s. Every so often, a new mastodon tusk or sloth claw or megalodon tooth still turns up, pulled from the same layers of ancient rock, proof that the ground beneath Bone Valley is still, even now, slowly letting go of pieces of a world that vanished long before any human being ever walked across it. So the next time you picture Florida, with its beaches and its theme parks and its endless sunshine, take a moment to remember what is actually sitting underneath all of that. Layer after layer of ancient ocean floor, packed with the bones of whales and giant sharks. And resting right above that, a more recent layer holding the remains of mastodons, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, and strange horned creatures that no longer exist anywhere on Earth. In 1894, a group of exhausted, underpaid workers, digging for nothing more glamorous than fertilizer rock, accidentally cracked open a window into that lost world. For a little while, the past and the present stood face to face in the Florida heat, men in muddy boots staring into the open jaws of creatures that had not drawn breath in thousands, sometimes millions of years. And then, piece by piece, the window closed again, the holes filled back in, the land smoothed back over, until almost nothing remained to show that anything unusual had ever happened there at all. Think about how strange that timeline actually is. A whale swam through a warm, shallow sea millions of years before anything resembling a human being existed anywhere on this planet. It died and it sank, and over unimaginable stretches of time, sediment buried it, compressed it, turned the seafloor around it into solid rock. Millions of years after that, Ice Age mastodons walked across the dry land that had since risen up out of that same sea, never knowing what was buried beneath their own feet. Those mastodons died too and joined the layers below them. Then more time passed. Forests grew, rivers carved new paths across the land. Indigenous communities lived across Florida for thousands of years, hunting, fishing, building their lives on top of ground that held two entire vanished worlds without anyone realizing it. Then settlers arrived. Citrus groves were planted. A freeze came through and killed those groves in a matter of days. And in the exact same stretch of land, almost as if the timing had been arranged on purpose, men with picks and shovels finally broke through into both of those buried worlds at once, all because they were looking for something as plain and unglamorous as fertilizer rock. It makes you wonder how many other places on this planet are sitting on top of something just as extraordinary, just as ancient, completely invisible from the surface, waiting for someone to dig in exactly the right spot, for exactly the right reason, at exactly the right moment. Almost nothing remains of those original pits today, at least not in any way most people would recognize. Drive through central Florida now and you will pass quiet lakes that look perfectly natural, ringed with grass and trees, the kind of place a family might pull over for a picnic without a second thought. Most of those lakes are not natural at all. They are old phosphate pits, filled in by decades of rain and groundwater. The scars in the landscape healed over so completely that almost nobody driving past would ever guess what used to be pulled out of the ground right beneath that calm, still water. The bones that came out of those particular pits, if anyone managed to save them at all, are long gone from the site itself, sitting instead in drawers and display cases hundreds of miles away, their connection to that specific lake reduced to a faded label or a half-remembered family story. Almost nothing, except for the bones that made it out, sitting today in museum drawers and display cases, carefully labeled, carefully studied, quiet witnesses to one of the strangest accidental discoveries in American history. A reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary things are found not by people searching for them, but by ordinary, tired, forgotten workers, just trying to make it through another long, hot day in the Florida sun, with no idea that their next swing of the pick was about to bring an entire lost world back into the light. And even now, more than 130 years later, the story is not entirely finished. Active phosphate mines still operate across parts of central Florida, and every so often, the same thing that happened back in 1894 happens again. A piece of heavy machinery strikes something it should not. A section of Earth gives way to reveal one more curve of fossilized bone that has been waiting in the dark since long before Florida even had a name. Paleontologists still get the call. They still climb down into active pits, the same way those early scientists once did, brushing dirt away from teeth and tusks that have not seen daylight in millions of years. The ground beneath Bone Valley, it turns out, was never really finished telling its story. It just goes quiet for a while between one discovery and the next, waiting for somebody to dig in exactly the right place, at exactly the right depth, and accidentally start the whole story over again.